breathing is thick with the sweet. Our breathing is thick with the sweet, nauseating stench of roasted human fat and charred timber. You cannot hear the bustling markets or the tolling bells of the great churches because they have all melted. The only sound is the wind howling through a wasteland of blackened bones. Yesterday, this was the beating heart of the Russian Tsardom. Today, it is a mass grave. The Crimean Khanate did not just attack your city, they vaporized it. You look around, wiping the soot from your eyes, and realize that you are one of the unlucky ones. You survived. And survival means you are about to be slapped in iron chains and marched 1,000 miles south to be sold like livestock in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. The Russian state is a bleeding corpse gasping its final breaths.
Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. You are standing at the absolute rock bottom of Russian history. Most people think of Russia as this impenetrable, freezing juggernaut that swallows invading armies whole. We think of Napoleon freezing in the snow or Hitler's panzers grinding to a halt outside Stalingrad. But in the late 16th century, Russia was not a predator. It was prey. The real apex predators of the medieval world did not march in neat lines with muskets. They rode out of the southern steppes on horseback, moving faster than a wildfire and striking with apocalyptic violence. These were the Tatars of the Crimean Khanate, the terrifying descendants of Genghis Khan's Golden Horde. For decades, they had treated the southern Russian borders like their own personal cash machine. Whenever the Khan needed gold or free labor, he simply rode north, burned a few dozen towns, rounded up thousands of peasants, and rode back down to the slave markets of Kaffa. But the burning of Moscow in 1571 was different. It was an extermination event. The Khan, Devlet Giray, had reduced the Russian capital to cinders in a matter of hours. Somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 people were either burned alive in their cellars or dragged away in chains. The devastation was so absolute that the rivers surrounding the city were literally choked with floating corpses, turning the water into a toxic sludge of decomposing meat. Now fast forward exactly 1 year. It is the summer of 1572. The ash of Moscow has barely settled, and the trauma is still carved into the minds of every breathing Russian. And then the scouts arrive with news that stops the collective heartbeat of the nation. The sky to the south is turning black with dust again. Devlet Giray is coming back, but this time he is not bringing a raiding party to steal livestock and peasants. He is bringing a coalition army of 120,000 men, backed by elite Ottoman artillery and infantry. He is bringing tens of thousands of iron shackles. His objective is no longer to simply rob the Tsardom of Russia. His objective is to completely erase it from the map, to fold the ashes of Ivan the Terrible's domain into the sprawling empire of the steppe. The end of the world is riding north, and sitting between this unstoppable horde and the total extinction of the Russian people is a desperate, starving, and wildly outnumbered militia of 20,000 men. This is the stage for the Battle of Molodi, the day the world was supposed to end. To understand the sheer scale of the nightmare rolling toward Moscow in the summer of 1572, you have to forget everything you know about traditional medieval warfare. The Crimean Khanate did not march, they flowed. They were a biological weapon, a localized earthquake of hooves and screaming horses stretching across the southern horizon, blotting out the green earth with a tsunami of dust. Khan Devlet Giray was riding at the head of 120,000 warriors. Let that terrifying number sink in for a moment. 120,000. This was not a petty border skirmish over a few acres of farmland. This was one of the largest, most lethal armies assembled anywhere on the planet at that time. And this army was fundamentally different from the raiding party that had turned Moscow into a barbecue the year before. Last year was just business. It was about profit and plunder. This time, Devlet Giray had the official blessing and military backing of the undisputed global superpower of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan in Istanbul had sent thousands of elite Janissary troops, heavily armed infantrymen, and a train of state-of-the-art artillery. But the most terrifying cargo was not the cannons. The Khan's supply wagons were groaning under the weight of iron. Tens of thousands of custom-forged iron shackles rattled constantly in the back of the wooden carts. The Tatars were not planning on leaving anyone behind to rebuild a nation. The objective was absolute demographic erasure. The plan was to chain every surviving Russian man, woman, and child, drag them bleeding across the steppes, and sell them to power the galleys and build the grand mosques of the Ottoman world. Russia was going to be liquidated utterly and permanently. Faced with this literal apocalypse galloping toward his doorstep, you might expect the supreme ruler of Russia to stand tall and rally his people. His title, after all, was Ivan the Terrible. Pop culture remembers him as a ruthless, iron-fisted psychopath who crushed his enemies, murdered his own son, and built a centralized empire through sheer terror. But when the dust clouds of the Tatar horde actually appeared on the southern horizon, Ivan the Terrible did not look very terrible at all. He looked pathetic. The great tyrant packed up his gold, his jewels, and his royal treasury, abandoned his shattered capital, and ran away like a whipped dog. He fled far north toward the safety of Novgorod, leaving the defense of his collapsing realm to a man who had every reason to despise him. Ivan left behind a fractured, starving, and deeply demoralized militia of barely 20,000 men. 20,000 exhausted, underfed soldiers to face 120,000 elite apex predators. The math was not just bad, it was a dark, twisted joke. It was a guaranteed death sentence. Standing at the head of this doomed vanguard was Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky. Vorotynsky was a brilliant tactician, a scarred veteran of the brutal frontier wars, and a man who had already been tortured, stripped of his lands, and exiled by Ivan the Terrible in a fit of paranoid delusion. Now the coward Tsar was tossing him the keys to a burning kingdom and essentially ordering him to die slowly enough to buy the royal court time to escape. Vorotynsky stood at the muddy banks of the Oka River, looking south into the approaching storm. He knew conventional tactics were completely useless. If he lined his 20,000 men up in a traditional defensive formation, the vast Tatar cavalry would simply wrap around their flanks and slaughter them all in under an hour. The steppe warriors were the undisputed masters of mobility. They could loose a dozen armor-piercing arrows a minute from horseback while moving at a full gallop. European armies had been bleeding out trying to solve the tactical puzzle of the steppe archer for centuries. Heavy cavalry was too slow to catch them. Infantry lines were just sitting ducks waiting to be pin-cushioned. But Vorotynsky was not planning to fight a conventional war. He knew he was leading dead men walking. He knew there was no grand reinforcement army riding to the rescue. The Tsar was gone. The country was already bleeding out. The end of the world was here. But if the Russian people were going to be wiped from the pages of history, Vorotynsky decided he was going to make the Khan choke on every single drop of blood. He was not going to give them a battle, he was going to build them a meat grinder. Let us talk about the man left holding the bag of a dying empire. Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky was not a man who suffered from illusions. He was a hardened survivor of both the brutal frontier wars of the 16th century and the even more lethal paranoia of his own Tsar, Ivan the Terrible. It is a bitter historical irony that pop culture remembers Ivan as a figure of terrifying strength, a master of absolute, unyielding power. Because when the sky actually turned black with Tatar dust, Ivan did not look terrible at all. He looked pathetic. At the first scent of real existential danger, the great autocrat bolted. He packed up the royal treasury, grabbed his elite personal guard, and fled north to the safety of Novgorod, leaving the rest of his country to burn. He essentially tossed Vorotynsky the keys to a house that was already completely engulfed in flames and ordered him to put it out with a teacup. This was the supreme burden of command. Vorotynsky was left standing near the Oka River with a shattered, deeply demoralized army of barely 20,000 men. Look closely at the faces of these soldiers. They were not shiny, heavily armored knights from a romantic fairy tale. They were a miserable, underfed mix of weary Streltsy musketeers, terrified peasant militias wielding modified farm tools, and a handful of German mercenaries who were bitterly regretting every life choice that had brought them to the Russian mud. Imagine the terror in their camp at night. The absolute, suffocating silence, broken only by the crackle of small campfires and the quiet prayers of men who knew they were already dead. They were orphans of a state that had abandoned them, standing in the dirt, waiting for a tidal wave of 120,000 men to wash them away. The ratio was 6-1. And that was just the raw body count. In terms of mobility, combat experience, and sheer psychological momentum, the odds were literally off the charts. The Crimean-Tatars and their Ottoman allies were the apex predators of medieval warfare. They did not fight like European armies who preferred to line up in neat, colorful blocks and smash into each other until someone broke. The steppe warriors fought like a swarm of hornets. They were born in the saddle. They could loose a dozen arrows a minute with surgical precision, while their horses were at a full, thunderous gallop. For centuries, heavy European armies had been bleeding out trying to solve the tactical nightmare of the steppe archer. If you tried to chase them down, you exhausted your horses, broke your formation, and they shot you to pieces as you ran. If you stood perfectly still in a massive shield wall, they simply rode in endless circles around you, raining down iron-tipped arrows until your army resembled a giant bleeding porcupine. Vorotynsky knew all of this. He knew that playing by the traditional rules of warfare against Devlet Giray was just a very expensive, very painful way to commit mass suicide. He looked at his exhausted infantry, his limited but potent supply of gunpowder, and the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Russian frontier. And he made a cold, brutally calculated decision. He was not going to give the Khan a glorious sweeping pitched battle. He was not going to maneuver across the open plains. When the enemy's greatest advantage is speed, you do not try to outrun them. You force them to stop. Vorotynsky understood the fundamental physics of the slaughter he was about to orchestrate. Cavalry, no matter how skilled or how numerous, cannot charge through solid wood and point-blank artillery fire. He was going to strip the Tatar horde of their mobility, their space, and their arrogance. The coward Tsar had fled to save his own skin, expecting his general to simply become a speed bump on the road to Moscow's second annihilation. But Vorotynsky had no intention of dying quietly. He was engineering a nightmare of his own. If Russia was going to burn, he was going to make damn sure the steppe burned with it. When you are outnumbered 6-1 by the fastest, most lethal cavalry on the planet, digging a trench is not going to save you. A trench is just a grave you dig for yourself in advance. Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky knew that static defenses would simply be bypassed and starved out by the Tatar horde. He needed a fortress, but he needed a fortress that could move. He needed a wall that could walk out into the middle of the open steppe, plant its feet, and spit fire. Enter the gulyay-gorod. The literal translation from Russian is wandering city, which sounds like something out of a charming fairy tale, but there was absolutely nothing charming about this piece of brutal military engineering. It was not a city. It was a prefabricated mobile slaughterhouse. Imagine massive shields made of thick, reinforced oak. These wooden walls were heavy enough to stop an armor-piercing arrow dead in its tracks, and they were mounted on a system of wheels and sled runners. They were essentially armored wagons that could be dragged by horses across the rough Russian terrain. But the true genius of the gulyay-gorod was its modular design. In a matter of minutes, trained crews could unhitch the horses, interlock the massive wooden shields, and create an instant, impenetrable ring of timber right in the middle of nowhere. It was a medieval pop-up fortress, but a wall of wood is just a barricade unless it has teeth. And Vorotynsky had brought some very sharp teeth. Slotted into these heavy wooden panels were firing ports. Behind the walls stood the Streltsy, Russia's dedicated regiments of musketeers, clutching heavy matchlock firearms. The Streltsy were not elegant soldiers, they were grim, pragmatic killers who knew that if this wooden wall broke, their families would be sold in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. Positioned alongside them were the mercenaries manning the artillery, loading their heavy bronze cannons with devastating grape shot. They checked the elevation of their guns, patting the cold metal, knowing that grape shot at this distance would not just kill a man, it would completely disassemble him. This was Vorotynsky's answer to the tactical supremacy of the steppe archer. The entire fighting style of the Crimean Khanate relied on geometry and momentum. They wanted to ride in massive, swirling circles, keeping their distance while showering their enemies with a relentless rain of iron. They survived by never staying still. The gulyay-gorod violently interrupted that geometry. It created an artificial choke point on an open plain. Think about the physics of the collision Vorotynsky was planning. A horse weighing 1,000 pounds, moving at 30 miles an hour, cannot simply phase through a wall of solid oak. It has to stop, or it has to swerve. And the moment that horse stops, the rider is no longer a terrifying apex predator. He is a stationary target, standing 15 feet away from a loaded cannon. The Tatar bow was a masterpiece of composite engineering, capable of punching through chainmail at a distance. But at point-blank range, it is mathematically inferior to a cannonball shredding through the air alongside 100 pieces of jagged shrapnel. Vorotynsky was not building a shelter for his 20,000 men to hide inside and pray for a miracle. He was building an anvil. He was deliberately constructing a hardened target right in the path of the approaching apocalypse. He knew that Khan Devlet Giray was riding high on the absolute arrogance of his overwhelming numbers. The Khan had burned Moscow to the ground a year prior with practically no resistance. He viewed the Russian army not as a threat, but as a minor, annoying obstacle standing between him and total demographic erasure. Vorotynsky was banking on that exact arrogance. He knew the Khan would not simply ride past a brazen Russian fortification. The steppe warriors would want to crush it to prove a point. The wandering city was fully assembled, its cannons were loaded, and the slow matches were burning. All the scarred Russian general had to do now was ring the dinner bell and lure the largest army on earth into the jaws of the trap. To catch a monster, you cannot just set a trap and hope it walks in. You have to give it something soft and bleeding to chase. In the brutal mathematics of the Battle of Molodi, that bleeding piece of bait was Prince Dmitry Khvorostinin. Vorotynsky had built the walking wooden shield, the gulyay-gorod, but it was anchored to the earth. If the Tatar horde simply ignored it and marched on toward the ashes of Moscow, the war was lost. Khvorostinin was handed the most terrifying job in 16th century warfare. He had to take a small vanguard of Russian cavalry, ride out into the open steppe, punch the largest army on earth directly in the mouth, and then run for his life without getting completely annihilated. It was essentially a suicide mission masquerading as a tactical maneuver. The Tatar horde, all 120,000 of them, was stretched out for miles across the Russian landscape. They were not marching in a tight, paranoid defensive formation. Why would they? They were the apex predators. They had burned the capital to cinders a year ago, and the coward Tsar had fled. They assumed the Russian resistance was practically non-existent, a minor nuisance to be trampled under millions of hooves. They were so confident that their vanguard was already miles ahead, practically knocking on the doors of the capital, while their massive rearguard was casually bringing up the heavy artillery, the supply wagons, and the tens of thousands of iron shackles meant for the survivors. Khvorostinin did not hesitate. He led his outnumbered vanguard out of the shadows and slammed violently into the rear of the Tatar column. This was not a polite, probing skirmish. It was a localized explosion of extreme violence. Russian cavalrymen, fueled by a year of festering trauma and absolute desperation, tore into the surprised steppe warriors. Swords hacked through unarmored flesh, and the sudden, deafening crack of Russian firearms shattered the arrogant complacency of the horde. For a few bloody minutes, the Russians inflicted maximum carnage, treating the invincible conquerors like cattle. The psychological shock was immediate, but shock quickly gave way to absolute boiling rage. For the Tatar commanders, this was an unforgivable insult. How dare these pathetic, starving remnants of a dying empire strike the army of the Khan? How dare the prey bite the predator? The sons of Devlet Giray, commanding the rear guard, did exactly what Khvorostinin prayed they would do. They lost their temper. They did not pause to scout the terrain. They did not send riders ahead to assess the tactical situation. They saw a vastly inferior force of arrogant Russians, and they ordered their warriors to turn around and erase them from existence. This was the critical moment. Khvorostinin had to sell the illusion. If his men retreated too slowly, they would be swallowed by the swarm and butchered to the last man. If they retreated too cleanly, in perfect military order, the Tatars might suspect a trap and break off the pursuit. Khvorostinin had to make it look like a terrified, chaotic rout. He gave the order, and the Russian vanguard turned their horses and fled in what looked like sheer panic. The chase was on, and it was a terrifying spectacle of physics and momentum. Tens of thousands of screaming steppe warriors whipped their horses into a frenzy, their composite bows drawn, raining iron-tipped arrows down on the fleeing Russians. The earth literally shook under the weight of the pursuing horde. The Tatars were the undisputed masters of the chase. This was what they were born to do, run down broken enemies across the open plains. They were blinded by bloodlust, deafened by the thunder of their own hooves, and entirely focused on the backs of the men they were hunting. They surged forward, an unstoppable tsunami of men and horses, eager to finish the slaughter. They pushed the exhausted Russian vanguard across the rolling steppe, closing the distance with every terrifying second. They were so consumed by the thrill of the hunt that they did not look at the horizon. They did not notice the strange, unnatural geometric shape rising from the dusty plains ahead. They were charging at full speed, utterly unaware that Khvorostinin was leading them directly into the gaping jaws of a 2-mile-long wooden meat grinder. The illusion shatters the exact moment Prince Khvorostinin's vanguard slips through the deliberate gaps in the 2-mile-long wooden wall. The Streltsy instantly muscle the heavy oak panels shut behind them, dropping thick iron latches into place. Suddenly, the open Russian steppe is gone. In its place stands the unyielding face of the gulyay-gorod. The Tatar cavalry, tens of thousands of them, are riding entirely on adrenaline and pure bloodlust. Their horses are foaming at the mouth, their eyes wide with the thrill of the chase. They are moving so incredibly fast, packed so tightly together that the men in the front cannot stop even if they desperately want to. The momentum of 100,000 horses pushing from behind turns the leading ranks into an unstoppable tidal wave of muscle and bone. And that wave crashes headfirst into a solid wall of reinforced timber. The sound of the initial impact is not the glorious clash of steel. It is the sickening, wet crunch of snapping necks and splitting wood. Horses weighing 1,000 pounds smash against the immovable oak shields. Riders are launched violently from their saddles, their bodies pulverized against the firing ports. The front ranks of the Crimean horde are instantly crushed by the sheer kinetic weight of their own army pushing blindly from the rear. It is a catastrophic, high-speed pileup. The greatest, most mobile cavalry force on planet Earth has just turned itself into a stationary, bleeding traffic jam. They are trapped in a chaotic, swirling mass of panicked animals and screaming men, frantically trying to turn their horses around in a space that no longer exists. But Prince Vorotynsky did not build this wandering city just to watch his enemies panic. He built it to butcher them. From behind the wooden walls, a terrifying silence hangs in the heavy summer air for just a fraction of a second. Then the firing ports slam open. The wooden fortress bares its iron teeth. It begins with a deafening, unified crack. Thousands of Streltsy musketeers unleash their heavy matchlocks at point-blank range. At this distance, you do not need to aim. You just point your weapon into the writhing mass of fur and leather and pull the trigger. The heavy lead balls tear through the unarmored steppe warriors, shattering ribs, severing spines, and dropping horses by the hundreds. The volley rips a bloody trench through the vanguard, but the muskets are merely the appetizer. The real nightmare comes from the German mercenaries quietly manning the artillery. They are not firing solid iron cannonballs. A solid ball would just punch a neat, singular hole through a few men and bounce away into the dirt. Vorotynsky has explicitly ordered them to load grapeshot. Imagine a canvas bag stuffed to the brim with scrap iron, rusty nails, jagged rocks, and heavy lead chunks. When the cannon fires, the canvas burns away in a flash, and the gun becomes a giant medieval shotgun. The blast exits the bronze barrel at the speed of sound, expanding into a wide cone of absolute, indiscriminate devastation. When a volley of grapeshot hits a tightly packed crowd of horses and men at 20 yards, it does not leave wounded soldiers calling for medics. It leaves a mist of red vapor. The shrapnel shreds through muscle, bone, and internal organs, turning the legendary warriors of the steppe into unrecognizable heaps of meat. The sheer, explosive energy of the blasts literally dismembers the front ranks, creating a ghastly, bleeding rampart of severed limbs and shattered torsos right in front of the wooden walls. The horses, bred for the open plains, go completely mad from the deafening roar of the cannons and the suffocating smell of their own burning blood. They rear up, trampling their own riders, crushing skulls under iron-shod hooves in a desperate bid to escape the noise. The steppe warriors, men who have spent their entire lives perfecting the elegant, flowing geometry of horse archery, find themselves pinned shoulder to shoulder, unable to even draw their bowstrings. Their weapons are entirely useless against solid oak. They cannot advance and they cannot retreat because the rest of their massive army is still blindly surging forward, shoving them deeper into the kill zone. Khan Devlet Giray, watching from a safe distance, realizes with absolute horror that he has not cornered a starving Russian militia. He has shoved his most elite warriors directly into a wood chipper. The initial slaughter was just the opening act. As July bleeds into August of 1572, the Battle of Molodi transforms from a high-speed ambush into a stationary, suffocating nightmare. The gulyay-gorod has done its job perfectly. It has stopped the momentum of the steppe. But now Prince Vorotynsky and his 20,000 men are trapped inside their own masterpiece. They are an island of wood entirely surrounded by an ocean of extremely angry, deeply humiliated Tatar warriors. And hanging directly above them is the most merciless enemy of all, the blinding, baking heat of the late summer sun. There is no romantic glory in a medieval siege. It is fundamentally an exercise in human degradation. Outside the wooden walls, the air has turned into a toxic soup. The thousands of men and horses pulverized by the Russian artillery on the first day have not gone anywhere. They are piled in massive, tangled mounds right in front of the firing ports, baking in the suffocating heat. Within hours, the bodies begin to bloat and rupture. The stench of decomposing meat and rotting bowels is so physically heavy that the Streltsy musketeers are gagging and vomiting as they reload their weapons. The irony is as thick as the smell. The Tatar horde cannot effectively charge the wooden walls anymore because the rotting corpses of their own brothers and horses have created a literal, physical rampart blocking their path. The steppe warriors are forced to climb over the bursting, sun-baked bodies of their own vanguard just to take a blind shot at the Russian shields. But the horror inside the gulyay-gorod is even worse. Vorotynsky engineered a brilliant tactical trap, but a mobile fortress has one fatal flaw. It has no wells. The Russian army is completely cut off from the Oka River. Within 2 days, the water rations vanish. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a wooden box, wearing heavy padded armor, firing a black powder weapon that coats your throat in raw sulfur, under a boiling sun, with absolutely nothing to drink. The human body can only take so much before the mind begins to fracture. This is where traditional history books usually sanitize the narrative, but we are going to look at the ugly truth. Thirst is not just a discomfort. It is a biological panic that strips away your humanity. To keep their trigger fingers functioning and their sanity intact, the Russian defenders resort to the absolute unthinkable. They begin systematically bleeding their own surviving draft horses, drinking the hot, thick blood straight from the veins just to keep their throats from swelling shut. When the horses run dry, desperate men are seen dropping to their knees, ripping up clumps of steppe grass that have been soaked in the gore of the battlefield, and chewing on the bloody roots for a single drop of moisture. They are quite literally drinking the violence around them to stay alive. Now pull your focus away from this suffocating box of rotting meat and desperate blood-drinking men. Look a few miles into the distance, safely out of range of the Russian cannons. There, sitting comfortably under the shade of a massive, beautifully embroidered silk pavilion, is Khan Devlet Giray. He is not chewing on bloody grass. He is resting on plush carpets, being fanned by attendants, and sipping chilled wine or fresh water brought from his secure supply lines. He watches the distant smoke of the gulyay-gorod with a mixture of absolute disdain and boiling frustration. The Khan refuses to believe that the remnants of a broken nation, a nation he personally turned to ash just a year prior, are defying his magnificent army. He looks at his endless sea of warriors and the tiny, pathetic wooden dot on the horizon. He does not care how many men he has to feed into the wood chipper. He assumes that physics, numbers, and basic human biology will eventually do the work for him. He just has to sit in the shade and wait for the Russians to die of thirst. But Devlet Giray is making a fatal miscalculation. He assumes that men who are willing to drink the blood of their own horses still have a breaking point. The breaking point of the human mind is a terrifying thing to witness, especially when it belongs to an absolute monarch. By the first week of August, Khan Devlet Giray is entirely consumed by rage. The siege in the sun has not broken the Russians. The pathetic wooden dot on the horizon is still spitting fire, and the pile of rotting Tatar corpses has grown so high that it is physically shielding the gulyay-gorod from direct assault. The Khan realizes that waiting for the Russians to die of thirst is an insult to his own legacy. He is the supreme predator of the steppe, commanding an army of 120,000 men, and he is being held hostage by a pile of lumber. He snaps. He issues an order that goes against the very DNA of steppe warfare. He orders his elite cavalry, the proudest, most lethal horsemen on the planet, to dismount. He commands them to march into the rotting meat grinder on foot, wade through the putrid remains of their brothers, and tear the Russian fortress apart with their bare hands. For a steppe warrior, fighting on foot is a supreme humiliation. But the fear of the Khan outweighs their pride. Tens of thousands of dismounted Tatars and Ottoman Janissaries surge forward in a massive human wave. They are no longer a swift, elegant cavalry force. They are a blunt instrument, a localized tidal wave of sheer, screaming mass. They scramble over the festering mounds of dead horses, ignoring the point-blank volleys of grape shot that tear through their ranks. They reach the walls of the gulyay-gorod and throw their bodies against the thick oak shields. The nightmare inside the fortress reaches a fever pitch. The heavy wooden walls, designed to stop arrows and deflect cavalry charges, begin to visibly bow inward under the crushing kinetic weight of tens of thousands of men pushing simultaneously. The wood groans and splinters. Tatar warriors, their hands slick with blood and sweat, claw desperately at the firing ports, trying to pry the heavy panels apart. They hack at the reinforced timber with short axes and heavy swords. From the inside, the desperate streltsy are firing blindly through the gaps, stabbing frantically with pikes and halberds, trying to push the meat wave back. The bronze cannons are running so hot that the metal is literally searing the flesh off the hands of the mercenaries who try to reload them. The geometry of the trap is failing. Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky stands in the suffocating, smoke-filled center of the wandering city and realizes a cold, mathematical truth. The wood cannot hold. In a matter of minutes, the timber will shatter, the horde will pour through the breach, and his exhausted, dehydrated men will be butchered in a confined space. He has to change the physics of the battle, and he has to do it right now. Vorotynsky makes the ultimate gamble. He leaves Prince Khvorostinin in command of the crumbling front line, ordering him to hold the splintering walls even if he has to prop them up with the bodies of the dead. Then Vorotynsky quietly gathers a hand-picked detachment of his most experienced cavalrymen. While the entire Tatar army is blindly fixated on the front of the fortress, deafened by the relentless roar of artillery and their own fanatical war cries, Vorotynsky opens a narrow rear exit at the back of the gulyay-gorod. He leads his strike force out into the blinding sunlight, dropping immediately into a deep, dry ravine carved out by the nearby river. They move like ghosts. The deafening noise of the siege masks the clatter of their armor and the hooves of their surviving horses. Vorotynsky is executing a massive, suicidal flanking maneuver. He is using the natural depression of the earth to completely bypass the colossal Tatar army. The horde is practically vibrating with bloodlust, their eyes entirely focused on the buckling wooden walls, completely unaware that the scarred, supposedly defeated Russian general is currently creeping up directly behind them. Vorotynsky is positioning his tiny, desperate detachment squarely at the exposed spine of the largest military machine on Earth, preparing to plunge a dagger into its heart. The deadliest weapon on a battlefield is not artillery or cavalry. It is panic. For a week, the Crimean Tatars and their Ottoman allies have been acting as a blunt instrument, throwing their overwhelming numbers against the splintering wooden walls of the gulyay-gorod. Their entire reality is focused forward into the smoke and the screaming and the blood. They do not look over their shoulders. If they did, they would see Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky and his surviving heavy cavalry rising from the dry ravine like vengeful ghosts, perfectly positioned behind the exposed spine of the horde. Vorotynsky does not order a glorious cinematic charge. He orders an execution. The Russian cavalry slams into the undefended rear of the Tatar army with catastrophic force. Firearms discharge at point-blank range into the backs of men who thought they were the hunters. The psychological shock is instantaneous and absolute. The steppe warriors at the rear of the massive formation suddenly realize they are taking fire from the wrong direction. The news rips through the tightly packed ranks like a virus. The Russians are outside the box. The trap has closed. At that exact orchestrated second, the dynamics of the siege completely invert. Inside the buckling wooden fortress, Prince Khvorostinin hears the gunfire from the rear and knows Vorotynsky has sprung the jaw of the trap. Khvorostinin does not just hold the line, he orders the heavy oak gates of the gulyay-gorod thrown wide open. The men who have been drinking horse blood and chewing on gory grass for days do not wait to be rescued. They pour out of the smoking fortress like a pack of starved wolves. The remaining German artillerymen roll their bronze cannons right to the threshold and unleash one final devastating volley of grape shot directly into the packed faces of the paralyzed horde. The Crimean Khanate does not retreat. It shatters. The collective mind of 120,000 men breaks in half. The men who came to erase Russia from the map suddenly drop their weapons, abandon their heavy iron shackles, and run for their lives. The invincible apex predators of the steppe are reduced to a terrified, stampeding herd. Khan Devlet Giray, who had been sipping wine in the shade just hours before, is forced onto a horse and dragged away by his personal guard, abandoning his sons, his army, and his legacy to the Russian blades. What follows is not a battle. It is an industrial-scale harvest of human lives. The fleeing Tatar army is chased relentlessly south, straight into the unforgiving waters of the Oka River. It is a mirror image of the horror they inflicted on Moscow a year earlier. The riverbanks turn into a slaughterhouse. Tens of thousands of steppe warriors, exhausted, bleeding and blind with panic, plunge into the deep water to escape the pursuing Russian cavalry. They are dragged under by the weight of their own panic, pulling each other down into the dark mud. The Streltsy stand on the muddy banks, calmly reloading and firing into the thrashing mass of men and horses until the water literally runs thick with a sludgy, copper-smelling foam. The mathematics of the slaughter are difficult to comprehend. Out of the 120,000 men who rode north to permanently liquidate the Russian people, barely 20,000 make it back to the steppes alive. 100,000 men, the absolute flower of the Crimean and Ottoman military machine, are left to rot in the sun along the banks of the Oka River. The immense train of supply wagons, the state-of-the-art artillery, and the tens of thousands of iron shackles meant for Russian wrists are all left abandoned in the mud. Vorotynsky and his 20,000 dead men walking have not just survived. They have orchestrated one of the most complete and devastating military annihilations in human history. The steppe threat has been broken forever. The smoke finally clears over the Oka River, leaving behind a silence so absolute it feels heavier than the artillery fire. Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky stands on the muddy banks, looking out over a landscape permanently altered by human violence. He has just executed the impossible. With 20,000 starving, abandoned men and a walking wall of wood, he has completely vaporized the existential threat to the Russian state. The Crimean Khanate is broken. The Ottoman expansion into the northern steppes is halted forever. Moscow will not be a slave market. Russia will survive. In any traditional historical narrative, this is the moment where the triumphant music swells. The hero rides back to the capital, the grateful king showers him with gold and titles, and he lives out his days in comfortable glory. But this is not a fairy tale, this is the 16th century, and the man wearing the crown is Ivan the Terrible. When the news of the miraculous victory reaches the north, the coward Tsar quietly packs his bags and returns to the ashes of Moscow. He does not ride out to embrace the general who saved his empire. He looks at Vorotynsky and he does not see a savior. He sees a terrifying problem. Ivan is a man entirely consumed by clinical paranoia and a deep, festering insecurity. He knows that he abandoned his people to die while Vorotynsky stood in the fire and bled with them. The soldiers know it, the peasants know it, and in the twisted, suffocating logic of an absolute tyrant, a hero is infinitely more dangerous than an invading army. A hero has the love of the people, and the love of the people is the one thing a tyrant can never control. Less than a year after the Battle of Molodi, the reward for the savior of Russia is delivered. There are no medals. There is only the midnight knock at the door. Vorotynsky is abruptly arrested by Ivan's secret police on fabricated charges of witchcraft and treason. The Tsar accuses the brilliant tactician of hiring a witch to cast a spell on the royal family. It is a pathetic, laughable lie, but truth does not matter in the court of a madman. The man who outsmarted the greatest cavalry force on earth is stripped naked and chained to a wooden stake, but he is not granted a quick execution. Even the Terrible personally oversees the torture. The Tsar of all Russia stands in the damp dungeon holding a heavy iron poker, physically stoking the glowing coals as Prince Vorotynsky is slowly roasted alive over a fire. The general who engineered the survival of a nation is murdered by the very sovereign he sacrificed everything to protect. He dies in agonizing pain, his incredible victory deliberately buried under centuries of royal propaganda. This is the bitter, jagged pill of the Battle of Molodi. It teaches us a grim lesson about the nature of power. Sometimes the reward for absolute loyalty and unparalleled competence is not a crown but a cage. The 20,000 men who chewed on bloody grass and held the wooden walls did not fight for the psychopath on the throne. They fought for the dirt beneath their feet, for their families, and for the right to simply exist. They won the war against the monster outside the gates, only to be consumed by the monster locked inside the house with them. If you have stuck with me to the end of this journey, you are clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story moved you, please make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification turned on. I have a lot more forgotten history to uncover with you. And before you go, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. In a world where loyalty is often demanded by those in power, was Vorotynsky's ultimate sacrifice worth the price he paid? Or is blind loyalty to a corrupt system the greatest tragedy of all? I will be reading your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter of history.